Welcome, Mr. Peter Reuter.
Thank you very much.
And welcome to our third edition of our VicLab Talks.
Good.
Thanks for accepting this invitation.
Happy to do it.
Just to confirm, you're from the Department of Criminology from the University of Maryland.
That's correct.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Reuter, can you tell me what sources of information can be used to estimate the size of money laundering?
Well, I'm very much a skeptic about estimating the amount of money that's laundered. Every now and then, somebody produces a number for a country or for the world, and basically what they do is estimate the proceeds of crime and assume that everything that is generated criminally is laundered. And there are sort of three problems with that. One is it's very hard to estimate the proceeds of crime. The best estimates, or the most sophisticated estimates, are of drug markets in the United States. And to give you a sense of how uncertain or how imprecise the estimates are, the range would be between, let's say for cocaine, between $14 billion and $32 billion. So that's a big range. And that's probably the most precise estimate that we have for any individual market. So using the proceeds of crime as the basis for estimating money laundering volume is already puts you in trouble because you have these very imprecise estimates of the proceeds of crime. The second problem is we don't have any way of estimating what share of those proceeds are just spent on routine activities of life. Low-level drug dealers don't have to launder money because they don't make very much money, and they spend on, food, clothing, and shelter the way other people do. You can call that legally laundering in some countries. Any use of criminal monies is laundering, but that doesn't accord with the meaning of the term laundering as sort of the general public understands it, which is using financial institutions to conceal the origin. So the second problem is that a great deal of the money is in fact not laundered. And the third problem is that we ought to subtract from the cost of the proceeds of crime all the costs of crime, like having to buy the raw materials to, you buy chemicals in order to make drugs. Well, you want to subtract the chemical cost, the chemicals out, etc. So there really isn't any systematic estimate of the amount of money that's laundered. Clearly it's large, but whether we're talking about globally a few hundred billion or a few trillion is hard to say.
Okay, thank you. What impact does the use of technology have on money laundering, and how has the crime changed through virtual transactions?
So it used to be that money laundering was conducted mostly through cash. And the sort of classic example of what people have in mind is, again, drug dealers. Drug dealing is a cash business. You end up with a lot of small notes. And I did a study of money, of how drug dealers, cocaine traffickers in the Netherlands handled their money. And they would get this money in small bills, 10, 20 euro bills, and then they'd pay somebody to convert them into 500 euro notes. That cost 3% of the money. So if you had €1 million, you spent 30,000 euros converting that into 500 euro notes, because that was more compact and was easier to move those internationally. So in the old days it was just cash. I mean, you could buy real estate and pay in currency for real estate, and then the real estate was now a legitimate asset. Now, there are endless ways of laundering money. Obviously, people are very interested in bitcoins and cryptocurrencies like that. At the moment, it doesn't look as though that's an important way. That isn't to say it won't change. Bitcoin seems insecure at the moment. There have been a lot of thefts of bitcoins from the wallets, and I'm not convinced that the technology is secure as it claims to be. But there are lots of cryptocurrencies being developed that might be better than Bitcoin, so I wouldn't be surprised. But then there are all these other methods. For example, you can load a lot of money onto purchase cards, which you can then take to another country and use. So you cross the border with $100,000 in these cards. You might have 10 cards, which have 10,000 on them each, and then you have 100,000 that you can spend as you wish. There are other methods of doing it that involve more complex transactions. You set up a British Virgin Islands shell corporation, which creates a foundation in Luxembourg that then deposits money in London, and voila, the money has become, if not legal, at least untraceable to its illegal origins. So as the financial system becomes more variegated, as technology allows more and more ways of holding assets, there are more and more ways of laundering money. It doesn't always go one way. It doesn't mean that money laundering gets easier, because some of these new technologies also allow for more monitoring of what's going on. But nobody thinks it's hard to launder money. A simple way of doing it is to buy a restaurant, and every night you have $500,000 you want to launder. You put $1,000 extra in the cash register every night, and pretty soon you have $500,000 of revenue. Now, you may have to pay taxes on it. You may have a way of being able to avoid taxes. But there are so many ways of laundering money that you hardly need new technologies, but that new technologies certainly do increase the variety of ways of doing it.
Okay, so you would consider that money laundering is easier in specific sectors?
So there are some sectors, so depends what you mean. So banks, everyone thinks that regular banks are inherently, they're sort of inherently at risk of money laundering, because critical thing about a bank is the ability to move money quickly. And any good control mechanism will tend to have a lag in it. Some time you need to scrutinize the transaction to make a judgment about whether this is a suspicious transaction that could be blocked, and by that time the money may have gone. So banks are hard to protect. There are some sectors of the some kinds of financial institutions where it seems easier to protect it because transactions are slower, there's more time to scrutinize, you have to, in any case, produce more documentation to show who you are. So some sectors are more vulnerable than others, but in any country, there are some very vulnerable sectors.
Okay.
No question.
Thank you. So in this context about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, how difficult is for governments to monitor it and to apply controls to prevent this phenomenon?
To prevent the are you asking?
Of money laundering.
Of money laundering. Mm-hmm. I think that money laundering, so No government claims to catch most money laundering. Typically, countries will say they might catch 1 or 2% of all the money that's laundered. So in a way, though no country would say we do badly, if you stand back and say do they do well, the answer has to be no. Banks and other financial institutions provide lots of data to governments. That data is useful for criminal investigations, but it doesn't result in many money laundering cases. The United States is very aggressive about money laundering, and there are only about 1,000 cases a year of money laundering convictions, maybe 1,500 cases, which is a tiny number in the context of the United States. Many countries only have a few hundred, and if you sort of try to work out what is the probability of being caught laundering money, it's a tiny, tiny number. So I would say that the system, you know, has to, in some sense, the system has to justify itself.
Yeah.
So we have created a system, that is the global system created by the Financial Action Task Force, is quite elaborate. I mean, anyone who has tried to transfer money internationally knows how many pieces of paper you have to fill out, how much documentation you have to provide. It's expensive. Banks, the major banks, spend billions of dollars, they say, on money laundering controls. Errors get made, and when I talk about errors, I'm talking in this case about people who are sort of labeled as suspect of money laundering who, you know, might be entirely innocent of that.
Yeah.
And it does result in some major criminals being caught who otherwise wouldn't be, but there, you know, there's a lot of expense and intrusion on the one hand, and only a modest amount of output to show for it, and it would be good if someone did a more systematic assessment than has been done about how effective the money laundering control, whether it's effective enough that does it need to be redesigned? I mean, that is really the question. No one's challenging that one wants a money laundering control system. Whether it should be as inclusive and expansive as this, I think is a reasonable question.
Yeah, well, thank you very much
Good.
for your answers, for your input, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.